I do this all the time. I wonder if you do this. Sometimes when you're reading a novel, I put little dog-eared folds so that I remember where I am, and every once in a while I'll pick up a book and I'll open it up to the wrong dog ear, and I'll read like 10 pages before I realize that I've already read this chapter. Or I'll sit down to a Netflix show only to realize 2 episodes in that I've actually watched the whole series. I just completely forgotten it. That's what's happening in the Gospel of Mark this morning. We could be forgiven if we start reading the passage and think, wait a minute, I've been here before. This passage might make us think, am I missing something? What is it that I didn't get the first time? Here's what's happening. The plot is the same in all of the Gospel of Mark. The big question is, who is this Jesus of Nazareth? People are trying to figure it out. And the writer in chapter 8 is not repeating the same text, but there's absolutely a déjà vu as we see once again another crowd fed, a crowd of thousands. And once again, the Pharisees confront him. And once again, next week we'll see it, Jesus heals someone. This morning, the question on my mind as we approach this déjà vu chapter is, what are we supposed to get? What is it about faith? It centers around faith. And when I say what is it that Jesus wants us to get, the us I'm talking about is the crowds, the critics, and the crew. Back in April, I preached a sermon on that. I do not expect you to remember. But all around Jesus, in all of the Gospel of Mark, there are crowds who just want something from him. There are critics who just want him to fit into their own narrative, and they think he's wrong. And then there's the crew, which is, of course, his disciples, the people who he's really hoping to train so that they also might do his work. First of all, it's me. We're going to catch up by looking at a map. This morning, we're in Mark 8, but about a month ago, we were in Mark 6 in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus here is constantly going on boats back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. Here's the map from 2 weeks ago, and I shared this map because I want you to see the context, right? So he hangs out in Capernaum most of the time, which is on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. And then every once in a while, he'll cross over the lake. Actually, I'd love to have a count of how many times he crosses over the Sea of Galilee. It's a lot. Last week, he went all the way up to Tyre and Sidon, where he interacted with Gentiles, and they received him. And they had faith. But his own people didn't. He came back to the Decapolis. In Tyre, he met a woman whose daughter was very sick, and she begged him to heal her daughter, and he said, I'm actually not for you, I'm for the Israelite people. And she said, yeah, even the dogs eat the crumbs off the table, so hi, you can heal my daughter. And he did. And then he went to the Decapolis, where he healed the deaf-mute man. Remember how close he got to him? He touched his ears and his tongue. And now we're still in the Decapolis. But in chapter 6, he was around Capernaum, where there were 5,000 men, not counting women and children, and he fed them with just a couple of loaves of bread. And each time, the Pharisees come at them with their measuring sticks, right, trying to test him according to their own standards, and he is not passing their test. All right, crowds, critics, crew. Crowds are trying to get something from Jesus. Critics are trying to measure him. The crew's invited in to receive and to pour out, and now we're ready. We're in the Decapolis. It's a Gentile crowd, and a big one. And Jesus has just healed the deaf-mute man up close and personal. Let's start reading. During those days, another large crowd gathered, and since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They've already been with me for 3 days, and they have nothing to eat. And if I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a really long distance. And his disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? I want you to hear a tone in this next sentence. How many loaves do you have? I could hear him emphasizing that because that's exactly what he asked them the last time he performed this miracle. Do you get it yet, disciples? How many loaves do you have? 7, they replied. Verse 6, so he told the crowd to sit on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them, gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well, so he gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. And the people ate and were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over, and about 4,000 were present. Okay, we're going to pause there. What is it here that Jesus seems to want us to get? Well, here we see he's compassionate. He notices first that the crowds want to be fed. They don't ask him first. And he wants his crew to help feed them. But there's more than that. It's a feast. There are baskets and baskets of food left over. And who initiated? Christ did. There's another hyperlink here to Exodus and to the manna in the wilderness. This one in John's gospel says, I am the manna from heaven, remember? I am the bread of life, says Jesus. And he's using the same motions that he will use later at the Last Supper. He takes the bread, he gives thanks for the bread, he breaks the bread, and he gives the bread. He's taking himself, being blessed. He's giving thanks to God. He's breaking, and he's giving. It's all linked together. All right, he fed this group who had come to receive from him. Let's move into the next verse. After he sent them away, full, he got into the boat with his disciples, and he went back to the region of Dalmanutha. I'm not going to pronounce that right. We're back on the map, back into Jewish territory. So he has been, you can see Decapolis there, bottom right corner, and then you can see Dalmanutha right there underneath Gennesaret. There will not be a test. All right, verse 11. No sooner had he landed in his own Hebrew territory than the Pharisees came, and they began to question Jesus. And to test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. Now, the original readers of Mark are probably scratching their heads at this moment. And probably we are too, because there have been a lot of signs, right? Which sign is it that they missed? When Jesus was baptized, the skies open and a voice comes from heaven that says, "You are my son, my beloved, with you I am well pleased." It's a pretty big sign, right? Or in Capernaum, where he spent many, many weeks and months healing people, driving out unclean spirits, healing sick and leprous people. A paralytic man walks again. A man with a withered hand in the synagogue on a Sabbath gets healed by Jesus. Jesus calms the storm. Jairus, the synagogue leader's daughter, is brought back from the dead. Are these not signs? Well, not only are these signs, but they point to the love of God, the wholeness that God offers. Do you know the Greek word for healing and salvation are the same word? He's bringing this healing that's wrapped up in salvation. Loved, fed, set free. All these things are what Jesus came for. So why are they still asking him for a sign? Well, I think it's because he's not following their rules. Also, they're not really open. See, I think what's happening with the Pharisees and what happens with us sometimes is we have our own story, and in our story, God must fit. It's upside down, isn't it? God has a big story, and into God's story we fit. Much more freeing. So, verse 12. Jesus sighed deeply. Can you hear it? And he said, "Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it." Then he left them. He got back into the boat, and he crossed to the other side. I love this. The Pharisees say, fit into our story, play by our rules, give us a sign from heaven. And Jesus says, no. And he leaves. He just gets in his boat and he goes away. He doesn't even stay to explain because the hyper-religious power brokers are not really interested in a sign. A sign is not going to help them believe. Their hearts have made a decision, and there will be no productive conversation. Interesting technique. Sometimes in our own climate, in our own culture, in the places where we live and the people that we interact with, we occasionally find ourselves in conversations where we feel baited. Like, doesn't really matter what we say. That person's already made up their mind. And probably I've made up my mind too, so maybe the best course of action is to walk away. I don't think that's the main point of this passage, but I think it's very interesting that it's there. Meanwhile, verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf that they had with them in the boat. Why is this sentence in this passage? Who else isn't listening? I think maybe the disciples aren't listening. They're preoccupied because they're worried about what's for dinner. We're getting back on the boat. Who brought the food? I thought you got the bread. I didn't get the bread. I was unmooring the boat. I thought you brought the bread. Oh no, now we're not going to have anything for dinner. And I'm starving. Okay, that's happening in verse 14. What's happening in verse 15? Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. So Jesus, as he walks away from what would be an unproductive conversation, decides to use this as a teaching moment for his disciples. He says, be careful. Guard your hearts. Because the Pharisees and Herod have chosen a dangerous path away from me. Christ is instructing his crew. He wants them to take away some wisdom. Now, I did not get into the sourdough baking phenomenon that happened during COVID, but maybe some of you did. What I learned this week is that there were no dry packets of yeast in ancient Middle East, that you actually had to keep live yeast in your kitchen if you were going to bake bread. And if the yeast that you had as a starter for the next loaf of dough went bad, the whole loaf would be bad. Does that kind of make sense? So when he says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees and the yeast of Herod, he's saying, don't put rotten stuff into a fresh baked bread of dough. It's going to affect everything. So be careful. And what is the yeast of the Pharisees? I think here, the context of this passage tells us the yeast of the Pharisees is hyper-religiosity. They're so tied to the rules of the law that they've missed out on the love of God. They've used the wrong measuring stick. Sometimes I do that too. God, I want you to fit into what I think religion is, and you're not fitting into what I think religion should be. And Jesus is saying, actually, I think I have something to say about that. The Pharisees aren't really listening. I get all messed up sometimes, distracted in my head with the minutia of Scripture and rules. I forget the big picture of God's salvation and God's love for all of creation. What's primary for us? God's love, the love of God. And Greg reminded us last week when we looked at the Ten Commandments that the order of the Ten Commandments was not that God first said, okay, if you obey these commandments, then I'll free you from Egypt and then I'll love you. No, that's not what he said. First he said, I love you. I'm going to set you free. And now, in order for you to live as free people, I will give you these commandments so that it will go well with you. It's out of love, not based on fear, not based on any desire to earn anything. All right, that's the yeast of the Pharisees. What's the yeast of Herod? He's sort of a passing character in the gospel. But Herod would have been considered to be a Jewish man who the Romans put in as like a puppet governor, right? So what's Herod after? Herod's after power, influence, wealth, popularity. Beware of having a hard heart, Jesus is saying. Beware of being seduced by power or wealth or popularity. It's not what I want for you, and it's not what I want from you. Both of these things, both of these people are trying to get God to fit into their story. Jesus is saying, no, you fit into my story. I don't fit into your story, right? They're both all about striving and control, the opposite of faith. They both show up in our individual hearts as people, but they also show up in the church broad stroke across the millennia. We're about to settle into another academic year, aren't we? Our calendars and our lives are about to get much more complicated. It's really easy to forget this warning. Be careful. Be careful. Don't let yourself be influenced by the priorities of the Pharisees or the priorities of Herod. Be careful. All right, verse 15. Again, be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Verse 16. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, then how many basketfuls did you pick up afterward? 7, they answered. And he said to them, do you still not understand? This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Here, Jesus seems to want his disciples to get it. And they don't, which is really good for us because we bumble too, don't we? They enable us to see a little bit more clearly. What is the it that he wants the disciples to get? I think it's faith. I think it's trust. I think it's peace. And they're so close. If only they could pay attention. I say that to myself 10 times a day. If only I could pay attention. What keeps them from paying attention? Well, in this story, it's bread. What about in our story? Sometimes it's bread for me too. Gosh, I'd really like to bake a batch of brownies today. Forget about Bible study. Or, I really, once I finish this series on Netflix, then I'll be able to focus on what I really need to focus on. Or if only I could clean the house. Or busy schedule. Or children. Or fill in the blank. Right? Listen, he's saying to his disciples. Why are you worrying about bread? Don't you remember? We've always had enough. And more than enough. You've seen me multiply loaves and fish twice for thousands of people. Here's a little footnote for you. The first time 12 baskets left over, he was feeding a group of Hebrew people, of Jewish people, 12 tribes of Israel. He's redeeming Israel, 12 left over. Second time, there's 7 baskets left over. In the Bible, 7 is the number for completion, which could be symbolizing, since he's feeding the Gentiles, that he's saving the whole world, not just Israel. Total footnote. Some people care about these numbers. I just thought I'd mention. I think what he wants is for the disciples to stop worrying and start trusting. To have the same kind of faith as that Syrophoenician woman who just wanted crumbs from the table. To flip their perspective upside down from the position of being the subject to becoming the object and God being the subject, right? It's not about you, disciples. It's not about the bread. It's not about the Pharisees or Herod or any of that. It's about God loving you. And you can rest in that no matter what. I was listening to one of my favorite podcasts this week. It's called the Mockingbird Podcast. It's a couple of Anglican brothers, Simeon and John Zoll, and they were talking about faith. A couple of definitions they had for it. Faith is living as if God is real and God loves you. Faith is living as if God is real and God loves you. They also relate a story from Nicky Gumbel. Tell a story about a missionary who was working on a Bible translation for a group of people who did not have scripture in their native language. And when he came to have to translate the word for faith, they didn't have a word for that. And so he was trying to figure out how to describe it to them. So he took a chair, and in whatever the makeshift building that he was building, he leaned it up against the wall, and he said, "What is this, a word for what I'm doing right now? Leaning this chair up against the wall on 2 legs." And they gave him that word. And that word means loosely to put or lean all one's weight against. I love that definition of faith. To put or lean all one's weight against. Faith is the inner capacity to trust in things that lie beyond our own control. And people put their faith in all kinds of things. In identity politics, in sports teams, anything you invest your heart in and appeal to you for some sense of security or grounding in the world, that's what you put your faith in. I've heard it said the opposite of faith is fear, but I think in this passage, the opposite of faith is control, right? The Pharisees are trying to control Jesus. Herod's trying to have and maintain control. And the disciples, in their own little way, they're trying to control what they're going to eat. They're completely missing the big picture. Without faith, then, the purpose of life is to consolidate your control, to shore up your power against anything that might threaten it. And faith, if it does anything, it says, well, there might just be something out there beyond my own agency, beyond my ability to make sure this thing I want to happen happens, because life is so constructed around our need for control. It's everywhere, isn't it? We're getting ready to start school. Those of you who are going to be seniors in high school, oh my goodness, this year is all about control, all about curating yourself. Some of us are getting ready to retire. It's all about controlling the IRA, right? We're trying to control what our real estate market is doing. We're trying to control how much we have and who our friends are and what our children are doing. Control, control, control. We get so wrapped up. And sometimes control is at the root of our fear or anger. So many of our conflicts are about control. And faith can be such a healing agent, can it, to the world, the sense that it kind of loosens us up a little bit, right? Helps us not to be quite so tightly wound. My sister was visiting this weekend. She's not a Christian. She has no interest in faith. It's actually kind of a miracle that we have such a close relationship, and she's one of my best friends. She was here, and on Friday we were chatting, and she said, hey, what are you up to this weekend? And I was like, yeah, I got to write a sermon. And she, God bless her, generous soul, asked me what the sermon was about. And I said something like, it's just the way people approach Jesus, trying to make him fit into their own things because they're so scared and they're trying to control things so much. So like the Pharisees, they're just trying to control what he looks like to them. And Herod's trying to control, and then the disciples, man, they're clueless. They're just stuck and they're completely distracted and they're no use. And it's really impacting faith. And my sister, who's a total rocker, said to me, well, I have a theme song for your sermon. It's 38 Special. Anyone under 40, I apologize. Hold on loosely. Do you remember that song? Hold on loosely, don't let go. If you cling too tightly, you're gonna lose control. Like, that's it. That's faith. We're not the main character. We get to receive from a God who loves us, who wants what's best for us, even when it's hard. And control is an illusion anyway. We might as well allow the one who calms the wind and the waves, the one who wants what's best for us, and the one who holds us, regardless of our situation, let that one have the control. It's beautiful, isn't it? How patient God is. How the one thing he seems to long for is not to have power over us, but for us to have faith in him. May it be so as we enter a busy season, as we're so tempted to put wrong yeast in our own bread.